impacted traffic, and yeah, thank you for being here. We're excited to have Tapati Guha-Thakurta here to talk about the publication, From the Depth of the Mold to the Making of the Artist Meera Mukherjee. It's her latest edited volume, and it looks at Meera Mukherjee's life and at the metaphor that is used to elaborate mold making and metal casting processes, to look closely at the themes of material and technique, individual and community work, struggle and resilience in her life story. A few copies are available for sale right outside, so please make sure you pick up a personal copy as you're leaving. And I would like to talk a little bit about Tapati. Tapati Guha-Thakurta is a senior artist and cultural historian who has written extensively on modern Indian art, art institutions, and public visual culture. She's a retired professor of history and the former director of the Center for Studies in Social Science, Calcutta. Her work is located across the fields of art history, social and cultural history, and visual studies. While based in Kolkata for her entire professional career, she has given several lectures and keynotes in India and abroad, and held distinguished visiting fellowships in the USA. Her three main monographs are The Making of a New Indian Art, Artist Aesthetics and Nationalism in Bengal, Monuments, Objects, Histories, Institutions of Art and in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, and In the Name of the Goddess, the Durga Puja of Contemporary Kolkata. She has also authored exhibition monographs and artist biographies, among them, in her own right, Remembering Karuna Shaha, The Aesthetics of the Popular Print, and The City in the Archive, Calcutta's Visual Histories. It's a pleasure to have you here, Tapati. Many thanks for coming here and being with us for this evening. I'm also glad that we have Supriya Banerjee here with us from Gallery 88 in Kolkata. And I've heard so many times that without her efforts, this publication would not have been possible. And before I hand over the mic, I'd like to thank Priyanka from Signable, who will be our Indian Sign Language interpreter for the session. I would like to request everybody to turn off their phones or to put them on silence. Tapati, now the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Abhishek, Arnika, Kodali, for hosting this launch of the book and this talk at MAP. I remember Abhishek Poddar's kindness in taking me through his personal collection of Meera Mukherjee's when I was last here. And I think some of which are part of the book, and a few of which are also part of the exhibition upstairs. And of course, as Arnika mentioned, Supriya Banerjee was really the person behind the book, because it was she collected Meera Mukherjee, knew her, like Abhishek, knew her personally, and first contacted me about doing a book on her. I'm embarrassed to say several years ago. And it never happened. It's only when her centenary was approaching that somewhere I felt that I shouldn't drag my feet anymore. But as people know, and as Kajri just mentioned, that I normally haven't worked on single artist books, maybe the odd small monograph. So this was a challenge, but I took it on. It took a long time. But like all of Meera Mukherjee's works, which I'll be talking about, or her working process, her notion of community art. This work is a collective endeavor. I wouldn't like to take the sole credit for it in any way. I have two co-editors here, and there were other research interns who helped collect the material and bring it together. So in every sense, it is a collective endeavor, which I have steered as editor. It is, as Arnika mentioned, an in-depth exploration of her life and work, her anthropological investigation into the indigenous metal casting traditions of the country, her radical reshaping of her artistic self and practice, and her building of a community art practice. I have up here the cover of the book. Okay, now to operate this. This is what often doesn't work very well. Okay, let me keep it. Okay. Yeah. Now, like her elaborately made molds, Meera Mukherjee's persona and productions emerge in the pages of our book through layers of different kinds of writing, including a lot of Meera Mukherjee's own writings. So the book includes diaries, scraps of diaries really, and her memoirs of Bastar, which were published in Bengali, but often very late in her life, and which have been translated into English for the first time in this book. And for that, I'm grateful to a young scholar, Shujan Mukherjee, who did the bulk of the translations. Now, this is both an art and archival book. There are flaws in it, as despite all our efforts, some flaws in color correction, some typos which remain. I'm putting it out there because despite all our efforts, it exists. But I hope the book will have a lasting value in presenting a hitherto unpublished set of things. One is a rare collection of photographs of Meera Mukherjee's work and of her working and her community life by a photographer called Arun Ganguly, who photographed her from the one phase in the late 1970s and then again in the 90s and beyond her death. In fact, her last work, which was completed after her death, that process was also chronicled by Arun Ganguly. What we also had access to was some of her private papers, correspondence, scraps of writing, which have been digitized by Rakesh Sahni of Gallery Rasa in Calcutta. There's a lot more there. I think I was able to only look at some of them. And the book was kind of going out of control, and we did have the centenary year as our target. But nonetheless, I think compared to other work that have so far been done on Meera Mukherjee, I think it is these which will, I hope, will add something new to a perspective on her, and a detailed look at material methods and techniques, which is, I think, a focus of the exhibition upstairs too, where I think, even though this talk is not on that exhibition, I think it touches on issues which will be relevant. Now, our title of the book is taken from one of her own writings. It's a translated title. The Bangla here is Chacher Gobhir Theke, which we translated as From the Depth of the Mold. So in keeping with that title, I'll begin with the artist's own moving recounting of her experience of a night-long process of casting. I quote, "During casting, my heart and soul," this is in translation, "my heart and soul intertwined with the mold as one. This inseparability brings with it certain experiences which manifest themselves in strange and surprising forms. Such experiences, however, have proven to be sound companions on my journey. Suppose the windpipe has been positioned incorrectly, and there's no easy outlet for the gases that form within after the fire is lit. Whatever the problem, the clay covering will whisper it into my ear. Like a patient struggling to breathe, the burning mold suffers, and I suffer with it. I do not know how to bring the situation under control, even though I fully comprehend the precarity of the process." Who is it that whispers these warnings to me? It is that being who revealed itself from the great depths of the mold and is no less a living and breathing thing than I. As her heart, mind, and body becomes one with the object in the furnace, each act of metal casting was for her a kind of trial by fire. The liquid burning mold, that she was pouring in, she knew, could be as unruly and temperamental, not unlike herself. Both needed to be handled with the same caution and care. With each of her metalwork emerging out of the mold, with or without flaws, Meera Mukherjee was also continuously recasting herself, both emerging from the mold, but also metaphorically breaking the mold. Published later, this extract which I've quoted from a longer piece, alongside a diary of 1970, I would like to use this quoted extract to position the artist at a crucial juncture of her career, the late 1960s and early 70s, when she began experimenting full force with her chosen reinvented practice of metal casting in the indigenous lost wax method. Signposting this juncture are two of Meera Mukherjee's early and most significant works in this new sculpting idiom. Okay. One of the sculptures she titled He Who Saw. It is a centerpiece of the exhibition at MAP for those who've seen it. Okay. Dated around 1968, it is one of her first attempts at a life-size work made in 8 parts and welded together. The figure and form here is directly inspired by the Gharwa tribal sculptures, especially the wax striation that we see, which she had closely encountered during her travels and survey of this region. It is based on a figure she recalls could be human, could be divine, which she saw in the middle of the woods. It was like an apparition, and she talks about that apparition inspiring this work. The other piece that I'd like to also mark out here, okay, it's actually working by pointing there, is her monumental elegiac figure of Emperor Ashoka at Kalinga, relinquishing war, laying down her sword, a work as enormous in its conception and ambition as it is in its scale. Made in 26 parts, it confronted her with some of her greatest challenges of funds, constructions, and multi-sectional casting. Begun in 1969, as a pacifist statement in a Calcutta engulfed with the violence and police brutality of the Naxalite movement, which some of us here from the city will recall. Her Ashoka took several years to be completed and faced many more years of uncertainty before it found a buyer and a permanent home in the lawns of the ITC Moria in New Delhi, through the intervention of Ajit Haksar and Krishan Khanna, who was actually buying art for that place. But before we move forward with the flow of Meera Mukherjee's life and work, I'd like to quickly look back through 2 slides at the rather long and diverse route of her training. And I put them up, and I hope some of it can be read. Okay. Now, Meera Mukherjee actually has a training that in different phases takes her from 1937 to 1956. She begins at the age of 14 in 1937, and the first photograph is when she's at that age with her elder brother and sister, when she joins the Indian Society of Oriental Art and is trained in the Bengal school style. So in a way, her trajectory almost takes us through all the options of modern art education in early and mid-20th century India. Then, following an arranged marriage, which did not work, she walked out of it. She finds herself in Delhi at the juncture of independence. In 1947, Delhi is the brand new capital, and Delhi has its own modernist art movement of the Delhi Shilpi Chakra, largely of emigre artists coming across from Lahore. And one of them, Dhanraj Bhagat, is actually her teacher and sculptor. So this is her exposure to a very different kind of training in academic painting, printmaking, but also an exposure to modernist art of a different kind. In between, there's a brief period when she trains under an Indonesian visiting artist, Afandi, Kwasama Afandi. It's an informal mentorship in Shantiniketan, Afandi was not part of Kala Bhavan, even though he was a visiting thing. She spends a month training under him, and to her it remains one of the most inspiring phases of her training. And below we see her portrait of Afandi's wife, Mariati Afandi. And then her most important kind of pivotal part of her training comes later when she gets an Indo-German fellowship, travels to the academy in Munich, and is trained there. By the time she finishes from Munich, she's in her mid-30s. That's where she's exposed, first from painting and printmaking to sculpture. She works under Toni Stadler, Heinrich Kirchner, and introduced to the Western Cire Perdue techniques of metal casting. She also has a large exposure to the museums of Europe, which have a deep impact on her. Now I begin, okay, next one. So two of these are her works from the Munich years. So this is a rare catalog we found in the Gallery Rasa collection. She's called Meera Devi. Divorced women very often had that name. So she was Meera Goswami when she left for Munich, but when in between, she became a Devi, and then finally she recovered Mukherjee as her parental title. You see her working in a plaster mode here, and this is her first experiment with a lost wax method bronze cast of a French Shilvanti. Shilvanti who later becomes Shilvanti Prakt. Now, following her return from Munich in 1956, the journeys that Meera Mukherjee would embark on thereafter would be in a radically reversed direction. These voyages would take her deep into the tribal forested heartland of India's villages and small towns across its length and breadth in search of the country's living traditions of metal craftsmanship. They would involve the kind of physical endurance and mental determination that would single her out amongst most of her contemporaries, and would instill in her a degree of knowledge and empathy with these artisans, as much with their working methods as with their rituals, myths, and ways of life. That would become the distinct mark of alterity of her vocation as an artist. Now, following her return from Munich, before her first journey to Bastar, she's walked out of a marriage, she's in the shadow of a divorce, dependent on her brother's family. She's fending for herself with school teaching jobs, as most artists did. Among her jobs she was at Dow Hill Kurseong, where people remember a teacher called Meera Devi. But she's frustrated because she finds the system doesn't allow her to experiment very much. Then she teaches at Pratt Memorial in Calcutta, also for a while. But meanwhile, she's also coming into contact with a small circle of anthropologists in Calcutta. With one of them, Dr. Surajit Sinha, she first saw specimens of Bastar metal craft, which convinced her that this was the kind of metal crafting tradition that she wanted to learn. Another crucial figure who came prominently into her life at this juncture was Nirmal Sengupta, a senior government official who was then living in Jagdalpur, headquarters of the Bastar district, and overseeing the Dandakaranya Refugee Rehabilitation Project. As you know, some of Bengal's refugees had been relocated there. A friend of Meera's elder brother, their association went back to the late 1940s and would, of course, later become a partnership of a rare and very intense kind. Nirmal Sengupta, the anchor of her life in later years, was the person who enabled Meera's first journey to this hub of the country's richest folk traditions of metalwork around Jagdalpur. On the very day of arrival, she remembered how he took her to the Sunday village market at Jagdalpur, where Meera was able to make her first contact with the bell metal worker, Manik Kaser, who was actually a Gharua who had taken on the slightly upper caste title of Kaser, and find her way into the Gharua Basti at Gangamunda. The Bastar, where Meera Mukherjee arrived in December 1960, was on the brink of immense political turmoil. As the princely state under indirect British rule, was integrated within the Indian Union in 1947, Bastar became part of the state of Madhya Pradesh, with portions of its western, eastern, and southern edges going into the linguistically carved out states of Maharashtra, Orissa, and Andhra Pradesh. And today that region is part of one more carved out state, which is Chhattisgarh. In 1960-61, the steady loss of land and forest in the region, together with the Congress's meddling in the politics of the local royalty, had made the deposed and jailed king of Bastar, Praveet Chandra Bhanjdeo, who we see here in a younger photograph of the Mayurbhanj family, the rallying point of popular unrest. At the center of this mobilization was what we see at the left, the revival of the Dasera, which is called locally the Dashahara Darbars of the former kings of Bastar, a politically charged ritual of royal legitimacy, with Praveet Chandra coming out of jail and returning after several years to Jagdalpur in 1961 as the earth priest of the sacred Danteshwari temple to take his place on the chariot of the Dashahara procession. So this 60s photograph is the closest I come to thinking about that. In Meera Mukherjee's personal memoirs of Bastar, in Bengal it's called Bastare Dinolipi, and it's been translated, we find a vivid description of this event in the center of Jagdalpur and a close glimpse of the returned king in an ascetic garb, holding the goddess's umbrella, playing out his role as the protector of the people. 5 years later, in March 1966, the chariot-born king whom the artist had beheld with awe was brutally assassinated by the police in his own palace grounds, along with several of his Adivasi supporters. This incident left a deep mark on Meera. Many years later, it is interesting, she returns to Bastar. She is asked to design a poster for another slain leader. So the figure of the slain king surfaced in her image of another murdered leader of the region, the labor unionist Shankar Guha-Thakurta, in a 1991 poster that she painted for the People's Union of Civil Liberties. So this idea of the inherited memory of one slain king being superimposed, and the poster says, the reincarnation of Shankar Guha-Thakurta through his death. It is in the thick of these brewing tensions that the artist spent her first and second longer sojourn at Bastar in 1960 and 62. There are vivid descriptions of a search for the temple of Danteshwari, the enigmatic patron goddess of the people of Bastar, where she travels from the Jagdalpur palace shrine through the forested Dantewala subdivisions, now we know made famous by the Maoists, the Dantewada region, famous or infamous as you see it, tracking other Bastar tribal shrines, gods and their makers in areas like Keskal, Bhairamgarh, and Kondagaon. And the chances are it is then that she met Jairam Bagel's father, Sirman Bagel. When she returned to Bastar 2 years later, okay. This is the only photograph we have of her fieldwork, and the location is unknown. It's a blurred photograph extracted from a film, but it's the only one where we see her seated with a group of tribal people. When she returned to Bastar 2 years later, Meera arrived in a different institutional capacity of a researcher holding a senior fellowship of the Anthropological Survey of India. By then, she had garnered months of training with traditional metal workers, first at the Bronze Casting Center in Bangalore, and then at the Regional Design Center in Calcutta, where she trained under Prabhas Sen with a stipend from the All India Handicrafts Board set up by Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. It is through the mentorship of another Nirmal, the veteran multidisciplinary anthropologist Nirmal Kumar Bose, that she secured a 2-year senior fellowship of the Anthropological Survey of India from 1962 to 64. The project was to undertake a comprehensive countrywide survey of traditional metal casting practices and communities, their classification by castes and regions, forms of metal alloys and manufacturing processes, and the kinds of objects that each group produced and traded in. For both mentor and researcher, it was an unusual choice. Professor Nirmal Kumar Bose, who was then heading the ASI, had a long-standing interest in temple builders, building methods, and material culture of tribal people. And he saw the immense value of bringing a practicing sculptor into the survey work. And Meera, in turn, took on the daunting role of an artist-cum-anthropologist, rising to the challenge of the stupendous fieldwork that lay ahead. Bastar was her first call once again when she began her travels under this fellowship in the summer of '62. It was in this stretch of the tribal heartland of forests and hills that stretched from Bastar and Raipur through the western regions of Orissa into the western part of Bengal, the districts of Purulia, Birbhum, Bardhaman, into Ranchi, Chaibasa, and Hazaribagh, which formed the Santal Parganas. It is here that she discovered her core community of folk artisans of a connected though scattered kinship, from whom she would take away the most in terms of the lost wax method of metal casting. In a place called Deripur, now called Doriapur, near Gushkara and Bardhaman, a center of Gushkara, a center of rich metal crafting practices, she found a group of artisans who, through their stories, gave her a sense of this meandering lineage that may have once created a connecting thread among metalworking castes across this large belt. She realized here, and this will be a surprise to many people here, that the term dhokra, which we are so associated with, has come to be associated with this kind of metalwork, was a newly invented one. These artisans, who called themselves maras, kamars, or kormokas, had never heard of the term until they came to work at the Regional Design Center in Calcutta. So dhokra is clearly a term that then takes on. It's possibly meaning, it is part of a technique which then comes to define the full thing. As with the Gharua kinsmen in Bastar, theirs too was a world of mutating caste identities, widely dispersing communities, and itinerant livelihoods. What struck Meera very much was the peripatetic life of these landless artisans, the seasonal nature of their craft during the lean agricultural season, and their frequent move from village to village with products in search of new customers. The demands of the survey, however, took her far outside this distinct region of practice to far-flung centers of metalcraft production across different states of India. Her tour data of the places she covered under the fellowship over 2.5 years shows the phenomenal energy and extent of her travels across states. So from Bastar through Andhra, into Madras, Bangalore, Kerala, Aranmula and Kerala. Then back to Bengal. Then she travels through Orissa and parts of that eastern region. Then she goes to Nepal. Then on the return, she travels through western UP, Delhi, and covers eastern UP. So literally, she couldn't cover western India very fully. So that is the bit that's left out. But she felt she had covered the bulk of it. Here was a 40-year-old woman, single, middle class, journeying relentlessly by train and bus, at times on slow bullock carts, on foot, and sometimes on foot when no other forms of transport came her way. The encounters were often more prosaic than adventurous, as she moved from hilly jungle tracks, village temples, and village market hubs to metalware quarries and workshops in small congested towns across the country, negotiating with owners of factory establishment to get to the artisans working inside. She would have appeared a distinct oddity and outsider in each of these places, where the barriers were not just of class, caste, and language, but also of gender. In the preface to her book, Metal Craftsmen of India, she wrote of her project as I quote, a one-man investigation by an artist, a sculptor trained in India and Germany. The man here was standing in for a solitary woman who was taking on his mantle with an irrepressible will. The artist here came armed not just with field notes diaries, but also a drawing pad, which he filled with drawings of objects, motifs, working tools, and processes in lieu of photographs. She mentioned how photography was not an apposite tool because of the darkness of the area, so she preferred drawing, and then later printing them. Meticulously documenting types of metal, materials, and techniques of making the last techniques section of the book the biggest and thickly illustrated. So these are the kinds of drawings that fill the book, and we've used a lot of them in our book. The final product of her survey, her book, The Metal Craftsmen of India, which was finally published years later by the Anthropological Survey in 1978 after Nirmal Bose's passing away, remains a forgotten masterwork in this field. The ASI has just republished it, but it was really out of print. What is remarkable is how adeptly she rose to her vocation as an anthropologist, publishing articles on the Ghoruas in the local newspaper Dandakaranya Samachar, and in journals like Forum, Rooplekha, and Man in India, and added to these in 1976 a smaller book for the All India Handicrafts Board on the folk metal crafts of Eastern India. Just the covers up. This is the new reprint of the cover. Metal craftsman. Okay. Now I come to a section, so the earlier section was called The Artist as Anthropologist. This is called The Artist as Artisan, The Ethics of Toil and Labor. By the time The Metal Craftsmen of India was published in 1978, the artist was well trenched in the development of her own sculpting practice, absorbing the folk artisanal methods of metal casting to create her own signature repertoire of large and small sculptures. Equally important, as I've already mentioned, was the larger worldview and belief system of these metal craftsmen, the frugality and hardship of their existence, and their complete immersion in the labors of making, all of which she wished to graft on to her own way of life as she worked at dismantling the divide between the artist and the artisan. There were, without doubts, many anomalies in such a self-positioning of the artist as an artisan. The paradox was not lost on the art world when in 1968 she received the President's Master Craftsman Award, something that Jayadev Baghel received. She receives it in 68 and Jayadev Baghel receives it in 77. Was she stepping in and displacing the bona fide metal craftsman by receiving an award that was legitimately not hers? Or in entering the place of the artisan, was she at risk of forfeiting her own artistic status? We could say both were issues at stake. In a later interview, she wished away the predicament of the award, saying, "It's an honor to be a craftsman, the bearer of a long tradition of a life devoted to creating and surviving on that." End quote. She was aware, though, that such a life was not one she was born into, but one she wished to invent for herself. And while she passionately embraced this life, she remained in no doubt about the singularity of her own artistic position in relationship to her work team. In this section called Material Methods and Daily Living, I'll look quite closely, both through photographs and some description, into a working method. My co-author, Adib Datta, a sculptor who was mentored from his adolescence by Meera Mukherjee, talks about how hers was a process of unlearning and relearning, a reverse journey from the European Sire-Perdue method of metal casting that she had learned at Munich Academy to the different methods of working with the lost wax process that she adapted from the Gharua community of Bastar and the Maral Karmakar workers of Deripur and Gushkara. Like them, she began to sculpt her figures in 3 main pre-casting phases using much the same material. Here she is sorting out scrap metal. Meera Mukherjee seldom worked with bronze. She worked with brass and scrap metal. We also have Arun Ganguly's amazing documentation of her working process. Okay, so 3 phases. Stage 1 was making an inner clay core of the shape of the object in a mix of different types of alluvial clay, which was called the core, and in Bengali, the kuton. Second came the detailing of the form over the clay core using thin coils of wax to create surface lines and patterns that will be reproduced in metal. This is all in the veranda of a house at 12A Poddapukur Road, a tiny 2-roomed apartment with a veranda served as a studio and workplace. Okay. Third would come the covering of the intricately finished wax mold with an outer clay body that would be layered with sticky clay, sieved goat and cow dung, sand and bran, and left to dry. Unlike the Bengal metal craftsman who uses a cheaper resin, what we call dhuno in Bengali, to make the main torso, she chose to work with the pure beeswax used by the Bastar people. She preferred their method of using beeswax mixed with mustard oil and squeezing the wax through a sieve, like we see here, through a noodle maker-like apparatus, to have wires of uniform diameter that she could use with greater time to work on the fine details over the clay core. As she began to experiment with enlarged and complex forms of single or group figures, each of these 3 stages of making the mold would become more elaborate. The third phase in particular took on new proportions as she began to create air channels jutting out of the models for the emission of wax during the dewaxing process. This dewaxing process is not needed by the local craftspeople because they work on a small scale, but it's something that was part of her training at Munich. She worked next on securing this outer mold with iron wires to prevent it from breaking under the heat of the furnace. This outer unit, joined inside with the wax mold and channels, was to be later filled with metal parts and lowered into the heated furnace, which is what we see her doing. These photographs bear witness to the deeply artisanal and labor-intensive tenor of her art practice. Where she's heating wax on the same oven in which she would be cooking, like these people would do, standing for hours, stoking the fire at the furnace, pouring the molten metal for the dhalai, which is tremendous laborious work. And in the end, breaking open the cooled-down outer clay casing to bring out the metal work. It was work that involved not only immense physical toil, but also other helping hands. And this is important. It also was work that kept her under constant anxiety, where a small slip-up in any stage of the making of the core, wax mold, or outer casing could lead to a messing up of the final product, throw away months of preparation, and cause a waste of wax and metal. So we have here an artist always worrying about the costs of a material and about getting money for the next round of work, and invariably on tenterhooks before every exercise of metal casting. No less stressful in these years was her insecurity about not having a proper place for working and storing her molds, nor a ready-at-hand furnace for her casting. Her small home and studio at Bhawanipur would be filled with her molds and finished metal works. And the larger sculptures, like Ashoka here, would stand in the small patch of ground at the entrance to the house, often for a number of years till they found buyers. The Artist's Diary of 1970 gives a vivid sense of this life lived on the edge. It is a particularly important testimony of a time when she was working full swing on this first colossal piece of sculpture of Ashoka, struggling with the challenges of a figure being sculpted in 26 parts, having to continuously improvise with the form, as for instance with the large squat legs that began to lose shape under the weight of the body, or the outsized arms that needed fixing in new angles. So she found that she had to work bottom upwards rather than the other way. So you first needed to understand whether the legs could carry the weight, and then only could you move upwards. Okay. Her worry was most intense later about not finding a place for casting such a complex piece of sculpture, eventually leading her to an industrial furnace at Patipukur, which is kind of at that time was really way inside. It's near Lake Town, but deep inside. And simultaneously, she needed to work on a number of smaller figures. So working on these from day to day, week to week, the diary is witness to how her mood swings from the lows to the highs, tied typically to the trials and success of her work day and the emergence of her sculptures to her satisfaction. There were two main workers who she inducted into her working team during this time, both of whom she had met during her stint at the Regional Design Center in Calcutta in 61-62. One of them was the young Nimai Bhaskar, young when he came to work with her. He was from a family of hereditary stone and wood carvers from Murshidabad, who had moved to wood carving and whom she took under her wings and brought over to stay at her Padmapukur home from the mid-1960s. Nimai would become over time her most trusted and proficient helper, whom she trained to participate in all stages of her work, especially in the final process of the dhalai, or the casting. The other was a Dedipur craftsman, Motor Kormokar, who first took her for the dhalai work to an artisanal hub of Kasharipara in Bhawanipur, not far from where she lived. The most skilled of these workers was also the more incalcitrant, as she writes in her diary notes, throwing her into fits of blame and anger, exposing the inbuilt tensions and the inevitable hierarchy coming into place between an artist and a master craftsman like Motor Kormokar. The 1970 diary pages also allow us to juxtapose Meera's chosen life of hard physical labor with a parallel middle-class social and cultural world of reading modern European literature very intensely. She knew French and German. Albert Camus and Thomas Mann were her favorites. Watching films and theater productions, especially Badal Sarkar's street plays, attending classical music concerts, and interacting with a small, distinct circle of scholars, artists, critics, and writers. In my larger essay, some of them come up. One of them is Stella Kramrisch, the art historian, who is in India at that time collecting folk art for her exhibition, Unknown India, who first inspires Meera Mukherjee to start working on a large scale. So, but there is a distinct group. The Calcutta of 1970 intimately hovers within these diary notes, signposted by films she saw and compared, for example, Satyajit Ray's Pratidwandi and Mrinal Sen's interview, by the presence in the city of the French filmmaker Louis Malle, and the scenario of the daily killings of the Naxalite movement that shook the artist to the core. A subsequent diary of 1974 marks another important creative vocation that the artist took up during these years and pursued with utmost dedication for the rest of her life. She was a very talented vocalist singer. So, weekly training in vocal classical music on the Esraj at the South Calcutta home of her guru Bimalo Prasad Chattopadhyay became now an integral part of her routine. Her sculpting and her music came to be closely intertwined. To each she brought the same dedication, discipline, and rigor. An abundant series of smaller and larger figures of musicians became from now on an integral part of her sculptural repertoire. And I'll just take you through some of them. Here is her own work of her on the Esraj. This piece on the left is a very early piece, very strongly inspired by Bastar work called A Musical Conversation. The bowl would be a repeating figure, and they would come in all scales. There are 2-3 large dancing bowls, which were part of her only public sculptures, which are in Calcutta. So, and then This is an identified musician, Amjad Ali Khan, she calls Maestro. And it is in the NGMA Bangalore. Please go and look at it. And it's an amazing piece. There's more works of her musicians which are meant to be in the Sangeet Research Academy in Calcutta, but they need to be searched out. Okay. From the 1970s, it is also clear that central to her life and work was the deepening bond of companionship that she had forged with Nirmal Sengupta. Okay. A married man with an estranged English wife and 2 adult children, Nirmal Sengupta resided in his own family home on Mohanirban Road, but would be with her every day at her Padmapukur Road home, making his daily presence and his intellectual mentorship the pivot of her existence. For those who came to know them closely, many would say it was hard to think of the person and artist that was Meera Mukherjee without Nirmal Sengupta by her side. It was an unconventional relationship, and it speaks of her living out of the mold in many ways, because it was a public relationship, but it was a relationship that never ended in a conventional marriage. It was Nirmal Sengupta who would steer the next momentous shift in her location and direction of work during the late 1970s. It involved a move away from the city. Okay. Anyone who knew the artist closely in her later years, and this would involve Supriya Banerjee and Abhishek, would have made a journey to Elachigram, a village on the southeastern rural outskirts of Kolkata near Narendrapur that became an integral part of her work cycle and her model of community life. Half a century ago, now you can't find Elachigram anymore. It's been absorbed into the urban scape of the city. But half a century ago, these areas marked the rural edge of the city. It's part agricultural, part industrial fringe, inhabited by the poor laboring classes. A long-time communist and trade unionist, Nirmal Sengupta began here in the 1970s in a village called Nolgorhat, a school for local children that he named Dhankhet Vidyalaya. This grassroots project grew into a broader literacy movement that, at its peak period of activity, ran 8 school units, a creche, a library, and a health center, manned by locals who had been trained within this setup. Meera Mukherjee started going with Nirmal Sengupta there every Sunday morning to teach the village children. Lessons in alphabets and numbers soon expanded into drawing and painting classes. Next, she started to develop a larger Katha project, whose drawings she would use as the basis for the women, often mothers of the children she taught, to produce stitched pictures of nature and rural life. Oof. This is not working. Oh. Okay. This is a painting she does called the Women of Dhankhet Vidyalaya, who are the small group with who she begins to train. Many of them are Muslim women. One of them, Idam Banu, became a very, very close helper to her. Okay. A novel form of community art practice involving first the children and then the women folk of the village, it was an imaginative experiment with pictorial skill development among rural women using the simple art of the Katha stitch. And Meera Mukherjee provided a very, very strict guidance of color scheme design and content. So some of these are part of the exhibition too. And we have to remember this is happening at a time before the Katha stitch becomes an urban fashion item of the kind they became. So this is still to happen, but she's experimenting with this. Another important parallel development at Elachi was the artist setting up her own casting workshop and studio in the house that Nirmal Sengupta built in an adjacent village called Elachigram. The securing of the space was his way of resolving Meera's search for a workplace that would serve all phases of her sculpting to the key stages of casting and could accommodate the making of her large multi-part sculptures. it would gradually set into place a systematic seasonal working pattern in which the Poddapukur house was where the bulk of the work with clay cores, wax models, and outer casing would be carried out during the spring, summer, and monsoon months to be later transported to Elachi, and the winter months spent at Elachi, where the enormous labors of casting and breaking of the crucibles would be carried on night after night. The helpers she assembled at Elachi were laborers drawn from the locality, without any inherited skills in clay or metal sculpting. What they offered was hard labor, a propensity of learning under her rigorous guidance, and networks for gathering her material, varieties of clay, beeswax, scrap metal parts, and fuel and firewood. What they also enabled was the forging of a mode of kinship and community living at the home at Elachi that Meera Mukherjee and Nirmal Sengupta cultivated through an ethics and austerity of sharing in what could be seen as a commune of kind, except that it was not, of course, driven by communist workers, but the mode of living was that of sharing and about a certain frugality and austerity. Again, Arun Ganguly provides a very vivid chronicling of her life at Elachi. Meera Mukherjee with one of the village children. Upstairs is a beautiful piece of mother and child, which could also have been inspired. She never had children of her own, but deeply bonded with children. So a long open balcony where the cooking and waxwork was done in one corner was also where everyone congregated on the floor for simple meals, as we see in the, sorry. Yeah, we see this, the shared meals, Nirmal Sengupta, Meera Mukherjee, all sitting on the floor, and they're all eating together. Okay. Indoors was the artist studio come living come bedroom, where, as one foreign visitor writes, Meera lives surrounded by books, paintings, photographs, and her sculptures. Here she worked and received guests. Here she sang, read, and slept, the foreign visitor writes. And the compound outside was the key theater of nighttime operations, of the laborious preparation of the furnace, the melting of metal, the lowering of the carefully trussed up crucible into the fire under the heat, and the pouring of hot metal into it. Meera in her sari, head covered with a gamcha, as you see here, many of the photographs, often her face masked, and her feet clad in casting shoes would be right there with her team through every stage in the work of the casting. However, much as she conceived of this parallel workspace as Elachi as a retreat and an alternative life from the city, Calcutta in an ever-expanding art world was ever present in her life, and we cannot ignore that. Not only did the Poddapukur residence continue to serve as a hub where writers, artists, filmmakers would come, there were other worlds too that she began to traverse. Far from shutting herself out, she was entering a peak phase of her sculpting and exhibition career with a series of major shows happening almost every year, 1980 onwards, at places like the Gorki Sadan, Max Muller Bhavan, Academy of Fine Arts, the Indian Museum, the Birla Academy in Calcutta, the IFAX Gallery and Art Today galleries in New Delhi, and the Jahangir Art Gallery in Bombay. She was also occasionally being drawn into new art camps and residency programs, such as the one that Vivan Sundaram began in 1973 in Kasoli, in his family residence, Ivy Lodge, where she was invited to attend the 3-week art camp in 1978 and produced a set of terracotta sculptures. The Max Muller Bhavan, especially following her Indo-German fellowship, had come forward to organize some of her first exhibitions after return from Munich and remained an important source of support. From the 1980s, a broader institutional framework of assistance for her work came to be provided by Seagull Books, Naveen Kishore in particular, who began to facilitate her exhibitions and sales. They held the first exhibition of the Dhanket Vidyalaya stitch paintings. And they brought up to parallel spotlight Meera Mukherjee's self-illustrated Bangla children's stories that became, again, an integral part of an oeuvre. And this is called The Story of an Old Umbrella of Calcutta. And it's interesting to contrast this with a sculpture she makes of an umbrella repairer. Her work at LHE would, over time, begin to draw in a few art college students of the city, especially those breaking out of institutions and seeking out alternative modes of community-based art practice, who gathered around her following a few metal casting workshops she held at LHE and at Goalpara Shantiniketan. From the 1980s, her sculptures were also attracting a steady circuit of buyers and forming around her a circle of art critics, scholars, writers, connoisseurs, and collectors. In Arun Ganguly's photographs from the 1990s, we see the artist exhibiting her season's freshly casting sculptures on the open grounds of the Elachi house. The sculpture she's holding is actually upstairs. It's the mother and child piece. I didn't notice it myself till it was blown up. We are also taken by Arun Ganguly through one of her largest exhibitions in 1993 at the Birla Academy of Art and Culture, where we see her standing among her works, showing them to visitors and potential buyers. It is in this shifting space between the city and the village, between labor and leisure, work and play, crowds and solitude, frenzy and stillness, that Meera's sculpted figures come to life from the depth of her fired molds. Each season, her work would range from several small and medium-sized pieces to large-scale works. Her gods and goddesses appear as ordinary village folk. So I'm going to now quickly take you through some of her works, except that I can't be quick unless this moves. Okay. Her gods and goddesses appear as ordinary village folk, like this raggedly ferocious Durga, while her laboring figures stand heroic and monumental. Their monumentality often manifests even in small figures as much as in the large ones. The rhythms of work spill from her painted drawings to her sculptures. The rhythms of work spill from her paintings to her sculptures and from rural into urban settings. Boatmen with their oars, fishermen throwing nets, take their place beside a pair of towering earth carriers inspired by laborers she saw at a Calcutta metro construction site. This is actually a very small piece, but you see the monumentality of the net, even in the small piece. This is a detail. This is one of the earth carriers. Okay. We see one of the earth carriers here at the Birla Academy exhibition, the female of the pair. The male pair was there, and actually the male pair resides in Bangalore now, and we hope it'll have a public display soon. Daily life of city commuters, queues and crowds repeatedly enter her work, mostly as a dense mass of figures standing in a minibus or at railway counters and passport offices. Upstairs, there's one of her piece on the passport office queues, also one of a coal mine. The abstracted form of a metal mass with figural forms and dense calligraphy animating its surface is rendered into these massed objects. Like, this is also in the map collection, a Ratha Yatra, or a Nagardola, a Ferris wheel. There are often specific observations or incidents that she wrote or spoke of that lyrically annotate a particular work. as for instance, her recounting of her trek through the Himalayas and the sight of the cascading river flow at Yamunotri that inspired her to make her spherical sculpture, River of Life. And I carry a short extract from this rush of water which unites man and water together. There's also another recounting of a tragic incident of the murder in a gang war of one of the young men of the Dhankhet Vidyalaya, Mohan, which moved her to commemorate him in life and in death in two of her sculptures. He was found dead on a cycle. He used to deliver newspapers on a cycle. So she was not there. She imagines him. This is a piece which disappeared from Elachi. So this photograph by Arun Ganguly is the only evidence we have. And this is a very moving piece called Mohan carrying the village on his head, much like Krishna and Mount Govardhan. Her closely melded collective figures had their imposing contrast in her large single male and female figures, like we see here, in various postures of introspection or thought. The one on the right is called Ihokal. It's a woman weaving a loom, but it's more about her connection between this life and the afterlife. Okay. She also produces these lyrical portrait busts of imagined and real persons. One of the finest of this genre being her portrait of Nirmal Gupta. We see here the portrait in the Birla Academy lawns, and of the young revolutionary poet, Bengali poet Shukanto Bhattacharjee, who died very young and is immortalized by her holding up the pages of his poem, Obak Prithibi, the wondrous world. And you actually see her bringing calligraphy in a big way into her work. The enigmatic persona of the artist flits about and settles at will within this diverse cast of characters. It is hard to decide whether she resides more compellingly in the somber repose of her seated female figures, many of these she makes, or in the restless energy of a whirling cosmic dancer, the Nataraj, where the force of motion almost springs free of the body, of this pirouetting body. In her interview and diary jottings, Meera spoke of her sculptures as her family and of her sadness of having to let them leave her home and her city. She writes, "The more I finish a set of works, the more I feel the urgent need never to give them away. I feel a deep blood relationship with them, which is why I never wish to let them go." However, her yearning to hold on to her creations was always pitted against the practical imperatives of finding buyers and fixing prices for her sale. The greatest challenge for her lay in recovering the enormous material and labor costs of her monumental sculptures, none of which were commissioned works, and were left standing for months in her Padapukul Road house, awaiting a collector. So I was hoping that the female and the male would be reunited on the grounds of MAP in Bangalore, an idea, since one of them already exists here. The artist's equation with matters of money and market remained perennially fraught. She was very market savvy and yet both unworldly and worldly on her own terms. Her practice centered around an artisanal mode of accounting, evident in the way she maintained a meticulous record of weekly expenses, fretted over any wastage and loss of material, and worried every year about raising enough money through the sale of a season's work to begin a fresh style of sculpting. As a modern artist, she saw nothing amiss in tying the value of her artwork to the basic costs of material that had gone into its making. So we find these notes where she's listing a work, a buyer, and the weight of metal, wax, and fuel, on the basis of which she will settle the price. So it's also interesting in the film upstairs how these craftsmen are selling by the weight, not individual. Their profit will come when it can sell as weight. Okay. Now, Meera's work began, as I said, from the 80s to find a steady market and a committed set of buyers. But her anxiety about a steady flow of funds never receded, nor did the many uncertainties and precarities, both of her working process and her personal life, made worse by illness and death of the working community at Elachi, and her recurring fears of losing Nirmal Gupta. And this is very poignant because in the end, he survives her by several years. But she's continuously worried that his family may throw her out of Elachi if she dies. So it's interesting how even such a successful woman like her had that insecurity, emotional, but even material insecurity. The more these tensions festered, the more she flung herself into a life of physical labor and unceasing work. In choosing the vocation of the artist as an artisan, she consciously embraced a way of working and living that would remain, in Geeti Sen's words, Geeti has written extensively on Meera Mukherjee, a perpetual struggle for existence. She writes, a struggle that never went away from the time she began sculpting in a chosen idiom until the last year of her life, and Meera would not have it any other way. Now I come to the last section, which I'm going to rush through because I know I've run out of time. This is about the last decade of her life, when there's a distinct spiritual turn in her worldview that became the driving force of a set of later journeys she undertook to far-flung parts of India. From a bodily submersion in labor, she was now transitioning into a phase where she looked upon her work as the highest form of meditation and self-surrender. In this phase, she was seeking out a lineage of a philosophy of work from the practices of building, sculpting, and painting in ancient sacred sites, especially in the Buddhist cave temples of the Deccan and the Western Ghats, and in the Tibetan Buddhist monasteries in the high altitudes of the Western Himalayas. The figure of the divine maker, Vishwakarma, the god of all workers, emerged during these travels as a focal subject of inquiry. During her early surveys, she had actually found artisanal castes called the Vishwakarmas, sometimes Vishwabrahmanas or the Vishwasramanas, who were concentrated in clusters around Orissa, Andhra Pradesh, and Tamil Nadu. Now she began to discover historical link between this caste group of metal workers and remains of Buddhist sites in these parts, leading her to a belief in a persistent strand of Buddhist faith among a large section of this community. Her book, Vishwakarma Shundhane, In Search of Vishwakarma, actually tells us a bit about this quest, both anthropological and art historical and spiritual. Now, I'll just take you through some of the sites she visited. The Vishwakarma cave in Ellora, on whom things have been written, was a very important site. And she remembers how one of the craftsmen, it's also called the Buddhist carpenter's cave, pointed to an upper row of seated Buddhist figures, which you see here, with their hands touching each other, and a central iconography of Buddha in his teaching position. She was deeply moved by the story shared with her by the local stone carvers about a finger injury of one Buddha reverberating across the hands of each Buddha in the row. The empathy ingrained in a collective act of making and injuring oneself, tying each worker to each other, was a lesson she had closely imbibed in her own practice. Another site she visited, among many others, was the Tabo Monastery in the Laol-Spiti region close to Tibet, where she found unbaked clay sculptures surviving from several hundred years through painting. There were also amazing paintings, that's why Tabo is now called the Ajanta of the Himalayas. So she's also very impressed by old monks she meets and their sense of self-surrender. They make work to cast it away, to give it away, not to own them. In the book that emerged from these travels, Vishwakarma Shundhane, later translated into English, In Search of Vishwakarma, this figure of the god of all makers remains an ecumenical being, freewheeling between myths and oral histories, speculation and belief, art history and iconography. It was in his metamorphosis into the great Buddha that his image shaped itself most powerfully in the artist's imagination, leading us directly to the making of her last monumental work, a seated Buddha, which he began in in the winter of 1996-97, initially as a commissioned work, but which soon took on a momentum and scale that outstripped the resources and interests of the buyer. The artist, and I'll here show you, sorry, the two images which feature on the cover of our book. The artist wanted it to be the most magisterial work she had ever attempted. An icon as vibrantly human as it was divine, a 14 feet tall seated Buddha in his Bhumi Sparsha posture. She also seemed to be in a tearing hurry to forge ahead. Employing 15 additional workers to assist her in the mammoth task, she was working at a feverish pitch on this figure she was creating in 64 parts, all through the year 1997, frenetically pouring all her energies and resources into this single work, which she carried out entirely at Elachi. Over the decades, she had advanced her technique of enlargement of form and multi-part modeling and casting to be able to now compress these processes into a few months. So while Ashok took several years, this is really being done over the course of a few months. Meera was working like a woman possessed. Several parts of the densely inscribed torso and limbs of the Buddha had already been cast, and some parts had even been welded together. She was waiting with bated breath for the head of the Buddha to emerge from the furnace without any flaws. The casting process had always been with her a highly strung emotional affair, ridden with anxiety and fear. Her elation at seeing the large metal head of her Buddha come out as she had envisioned it was cathartic. By this time, like each time, her sense of relief was as overwhelming as her exhaustion. But this time, it took a massive toll on her failing health. A few nights after the head emerged from the mold, on 27 January 1998, she succumbed to a massive heart attack. It almost appeared as if she had brought on her own death as a final act of self-surrender. Like the Buddhist monks of yore, she too had freed herself from all attachments, leaving her last work in fragments, knowing it may or may not ever come together. She had even planned a location at Bhawanipur for the final work of the welding of the Buddha in the compound of the house of Adip's father, Mr. Ashim Datta. But the end came a few months too early, robbing her of the last stretch of time she needed to complete the work. She died, though, as she would have wanted to, working till the last, slipping away into the night in a distant retreat, surrounded only by her sculptures and the family of workers who she looked upon as her kith and kin. There's a postscript which I will not read, but I want to say that it was something of a miracle that the Buddha was completed. Because it required the raising of funds, and it required her working team coming together to finish it without her supervising presence. They worked without any wages and completed the work to the near exact instructions of the artist. This became the greatest testimony to the dedication and expertise that Meera had inculcated in the people who worked with her. All through her sculpting career, this group never rose above her role as workers and assistants. With the Buddha, in a way, they became for the first time her collaborators. To make this posthumously completed sculpture a first genuine specimen of the model of community art she had nurtured. If it carried the unmistakable imprint of the artist, it also bore the marks of all the hands that collectively worked together to give the sculpture its final form. Now, the casting is finished in Elachi, and these are some of the art college students. It then travels as a truckload of parts to Bhawanipur, to the site where it was meant to be welded, and where it's the local welders of Bhawanipur, led by somebody called Haradhan Ghosh, under the supervision of Anitto, who completes it. Now, on the left is a Buddha in a not a very good photograph, seated in Bhawanipur after it's finished. It's finished in May 1998, and then, of course, it has no buyers. It's again seated there for a long time. Odeep remembers seeing it as a child. And finally, it is acquired by the Goodrick Tea Group, and it undergoes one more dismantling to be taken to Darjeeling and to the head of a tea estate at Badam Tam, where it still stands. So this next dramatic phase in the life of a Buddha, journeying. So she was, it seems, a part of this, almost implicitly a part of this last phase of the Buddha's life, journeying with him to the mountains she loves so much, securing his permanent home high on a hilltop of the Badam Tam tea estate in the Darjeeling district owned by the Goodrick Group. Left in paths by his maker, made and remade by many hands, transported over time from Elachi to Bhawanipur, then to the Goodrick office grounds on Guru Shadai Road, and finally to the Badam Tam tea estate, Meera Mukherjee's last Buddha has undergone several metamorphoses in form, location, and identity. We could think of the Goodrick acquisition of this sculpture for its Darjeeling tea gardens as an exemplary instance of corporate investment in a novel kind of public art. But the person acquiring it was a practicing Buddhist himself. So we are also pushed to think of another kind of radical makeover that the Buddha undergoes as he moves far from the art world to a distant mountain venue and finds himself transformed from a work of contemporary art into a devotional icon amidst another community of laborers, the tea plantation workers. There is no name, provenance, or signage around the sculpture. The climb to the location is very steep, and only a few who know make this artistic pilgrimage to this remote hilltop to view Meera Mukherjee's last masterpiece. The iconic image achieves its highest purpose in becoming one with its maker. To stand before her Buddha is to sense the artist breaking free of her artistic ego, throwing it to the winds, sweeping the mountains, and disappearing within the luminescence of her final creation. So the artwork here is a worshipped icon. Thank you.
Tapti, thank you so much for taking us through this wealth of material and bringing Meera Mukherjee a little bit closer to us this evening. I believe that your lecture is the short version of the essay.
Was too long.
No, not at all. Could have listened much longer.
Hold at least some of your attention.
But yeah, we have a little bit of time for some questions if you would like to ask anything. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, yes. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I had a quick question. I was wondering whether there was anything in her diaries about why she took so much to the wax threads technique.
Why she took so much to the
wax threads. I mean, although she toured and travels and she has learned so much, she documents it. It just feels that she's a lot more closer to this technique than anything else.
Yeah, so she mentioned, in her later work, the nature of the wax strands begin to change. So the initial works, you see a lot of this ribbed effects which the Bastar sculptures have. But as we see with Jaydev Baghel too, he also moves quite far from that, right? He begins to work. In her case, her later work are much more flattened. So she begins to use the wax coil more for detailing. So the body is all for the calligraphy. Calligraphy becomes so important. So the Buddha's body, which is not evident, is full of stories from Buddha's life. So it's like a whole set of cycle of sculpting within a single sculpture. So she begins to use the wax striation and stranding to her own interest to create this kind of, she wouldn't like the word ornamentation at all, but to create detailing, to create work on the surface, but it's all done it's not done in metal after the breaking of the mold. It's all done in the waxwork stage, so that what emerges is also accidental, because as we see, sometimes the wax disappear, as this old mold which you all used upstairs. So often, every detail may not come. She does minimum finishing on the final work.
I'd like to share a story with Meera Di. There was this amazing sculpture she had of a dog, which was in those shelves in her living room. I don't know if you remember having been there. And I had just gotten engaged to Radhika, and Radhika was obsessed with dogs. So I thought, why don't I buy this dog sculpture for her and gift it to her? The next time I went there, the sculpture wasn't there.
Yeah, so I use it in my opening slide. The dog was called Bhulu. It was one of her own pets who traveled with her between Poddapukur to Elachi and back.
But I'm not sure this is the same dog we are talking about,
Maybe not,
because that sculpture was gone the next time I went to her place, and I said, where is the sculpture? And she changed the topic. And I asked her again, and then the third time, she said, Chodo na. So I said, what happened to it? She said, you know, I didn't have money to buy the metal for my next sculpture, so I melted that down. And I said, Didi, how much money did you need for that other sculpture? And she said, 4,000 rupees.
Yeah.
So it was something so small. And I said, why didn't you just ask for the money? And she said, I don't like to ask anybody for anything. This was one. The other was, she gifted a small sculpture. It was my sister's wedding.
And this is an amazing story. I know this.
So she gave the sculpture as a gift to me to give to my sister on her wedding. And I thought it was a little excessive, but she would refuse to take the money for it. And I knew that after having heard the dog story, I just couldn't take it like that. Because she wouldn't take the money, I decided to give her a gift which was worth about double of what the sculpture was worth, which translated into a small pair of diamond earrings. She said, what am I going to do with this? This is far too excessive. I said, no, Didi has given this for the wedding for you. And the next time I went after that, I saw her maid wearing those earrings. It was possibly the most valuable thing that she owned. And she saw me looking at the earrings on her maid's ears, and she's saying, "Tum uska kaan ka dekh raha hai?" I said, "हाँ दीदी." She's saying, "तुम हमको दे दिया तब तो हमारा हो गया." I said, "हाँ." She's saying, "हम उसका जो करे." I said, "एकदम." She's saying, "देखो, हम पहनेगा हम तो देख ही नहीं सकता है, ये पहनेगा तो हम रोज देख सकता है," which was so beautiful. And I don't know if she just thought that because this kid is feeling bad, I should say this, but I mean, I would obviously love to give her the benefit of the doubt, but it was just the most amazing thing and something I would never, ever forget. She was really special. And, you know, seeing her with her musical instrument, and I don't know where this recording has gone, there was a sculpture she'd done called Chala Chali Ka Khela, which also has the calligraphy on it. Okay. And it's about 2-3 people playing the music. That sculpture is with my sister. I gave it to her on her wedding. She sang that and I'd recorded it. But for the life of me, that was in the...
There's a film from 1981, a West Bengal government film, which I said I share with Arnika. It's made by somebody called Anjan Roy, which carries amazing segments on her working process, all at Poddapukur, and many of the sculptures. And it has a small section of her singing. You can hear her singing. She would never sing in public, as you know, and you know, it was not that, but it has that, but the audio quality has become very bad. But that's the only thing we have. I don't think she ever wanted to be recorded, you know,
but,
so I don't
think
that...
But she allowed me to record it,
yeah,
and
but
I just don't know.
informally maybe, yeah.
That was 35 years ago or more. I just don't know where that is, and whether we even have the equipment to play it today, but firstly to find it.
Yeah.
But thank you for this amazing talk.
Oh, but thank you also for those anecdotes. You see, it's amazing how much the art world and the art market has changed in the years that have elapsed. And you see, she's selling for 4,000, 5,000, 8,000 through the 80s. Ashok Chatterjee remembers buying for 4,000. it is a fair amount of money then, but she's continuously short of funds. And her relationship with Seagull also became fraught because Naveen Kishore gave her money for a season's work and then walked off with the full season's work. So there was tension in her asking for money too, right? Because she's borrowing money to get her work rewelded. So this is the stress she's working under, despite the fact that her work is beginning to sell and she's leading such a frugal, life. So to me, it's very interesting now her work, there's a kind of hype in the price. It's now hitting crores. But I begin to think Meera Mukherjee left no estate. In fact, she truly left nothing because her home in Bhawanipur was a rented apartment, which is today demolished, and Elachi home no longer exists. There is no estate. Nimai protected her sculptures till her sisters came, and then her work has been dispersed, right? And they're now huge prices, but there's no estate or family that is the beneficiary of this. So, in a way, her works now keep moving from collection to collection, and the prices keep rising with it.
I must share the story of the earth carriers, the ones that you showed. So it was that little courtyard which was no bigger than the space that we are standing in.
Place.
And these two monumental sculptures would stand there. And I kept asking her to sell it, and she said no. She had made that hoping that the Calcutta Metro would buy it.
Yeah, these were metro workers.
And she'd spent a large part of her income on that. And when I said, but why don't you sell this? Because you're always in need of money. She's saying, if I sell this, a whole building will come here. I said, there's no space for someone to put a bed. How the hell will a building come here? She refused to part with it until one day I found the woman missing. And it was only the man standing there. And I said, what happened? And she said, oh, this guy refused to leave without it. So just to get rid of him, I agreed to sell that. So I said, now I'm going to refuse to leave until you give me the man. And that's how we got that work.
Yeah, so this is as I said, both worldly and unworldly on the same term. So in one sense, she is desperate to sell. But again, she has her own sense of what an ideal location for a work is. So Ashoka was in the airport hotel in Calcutta, but they didn't cover the amount. So finally, Ajit Haksar acquires it. But it's something like a piece of that in 78 is for 2 lakhs or something, right?
No, it was much less.
Much less, yeah? Okay, so I don't know the prices. I'm coming across some of the prices there. But this idea that those 2 pieces should stand, where the workers worked is quite amazing. Calcutta did not do justice. We have no public works of her. The 3 bowls in the Nandan complex, one has been defaced and has disappeared. And there only 2 remain. And nobody even knows they exist there. They're 2 magnificent figure of bowls. So, in a way, the city turned its back on her art. And it's now everywhere. So, it would have been, can you imagine how amazing it would have been to have had these 2 huge sculptures at some site, around there. But I think she had a sense also of, when she made these large works, of what an ideal location would be. And I think maybe that's why she didn't want to sell it. But I think this is her tension. She needs the money, she has to sell, but she's very, very kind of careful about who she sells to, where it will go. This idea that they are my blood relations, so I must be very careful where they go. All of that is part of her.
She was very attached to her work.
Yeah.
I remember you're talking about the Calcutta Airport Hotel. And in the buffet one day, whenever a flight would be late, you would go to the Calcutta Airport Hotel because sometimes the flight would be 3 hours late and this was literally 5 minutes away. The fruit bowl in the buffet was the lap of one of Meera's sculptures. I just couldn't believe that. It was filled with apples and oranges. And it was actually a Meera sculpture.
Yeah, a lot of the work, there's a hanging bird she made. These have disappeared.
But the hanging bird is there at the LIC complex.
Well, now you can tell me much more now, because when the Calcutta Airport Hotel was demolished and the airport hotel ceased to exist, it all moved. So the Ashoka went back to her house and she was going to melt it down because she said, I've spent so much on it, I would melt it down. Now, maybe that's rhetorical. We don't know whether she would have really melted it down. She does melt down smaller works sometimes. When I think they bought it, I think Ajit Haksar and Ashok Chatterjee negotiated a deal and it moved there. So, I think because none of these are commissioned works, these large pieces, it's a huge challenge for her.
There is one commissioned work.
Which one?
Which is upstairs, Melody.
Yeah, but that's not a large work. I know. That was done for your parents.
It was for my parents' silver anniversary.
Yeah.
And it was to be done in silver. But she wanted some 25, 30 kilos of silver for a sculpture which was 2 kilos. I said, why? She's saying the rest will go out with the wax. And I said, no, let's just stick to bronze then.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tapati. Thank you, Priyanka, for signing for 1.5 hours. And thank you to the audience for being here. Would like to invite you to see the exhibition on the 3rd floor outside in if you haven't seen it. We brought the works of Meera Mukherjee and Jaidev Baghel together, and you can trace a very interesting story of 2 artists really transgressing boundaries and going into different worlds to practice. I wish you all a very good evening. Please do pick up a copy outside on your way out.
Don't feel obliged to.
No, you should feel obliged.
My publisher said you have to stand there and say, buy the book. I said, I'm not the publisher.
I'll do that for you.
That.
But thank you for being here and have a good night and a safe journey home.
Thank you for staying through a long talk too.